Today I have for you a fantastic game featuring a gorgeous engine-like finish that you really gotta see. I absolutely love this one, and it serves as a stunning reminder of a major change that is coming to the world of chess, whether we like it or not. And that is the dethroning of Magnus Carlsen as the world's #1 player. He's had a nice day in the sun, sitting at the top of FIDE's rating list since 2011, but with his rating down 50 points from its all-time high, there are now looming threats in what may be the twilight of his chess dominance, the most menacing of which just might be the 18-year-old Damaraju Gukesh, who with a FIDE rating of 2783 is a mere 50 points away from overtaking Carlsen's current rating of 2831. Gukesh has been a force to be reckoned with ever since his record-breaking defeat of Magnus Carlsen at the age of 16 in this unbelievable rapid game from round 9 of the 2022 AIM Chess Preliminaries that we're going to take a look at right now. Gukesh, playing white, gets the party started with e4. Magnus responds e6, the French defense, allowing Gukesh to set up his ideal pawn duo with the move d4, which Magnus challenges immediately with d5, supported by e6. Knight to c3 defends e4. Knight to f6 increases the pressure, which white has a few good ways to deal with in the French. You could pin the knight with bishop to g5. You could capture on d5. But Gukesh goes with the move that I like best, e5, just grabbing some space, kicking that knight off of the f6 square, and then following up with f4. I love me a pawn wedge. But pawn wedges are not meant to be left alone, and Magnus bites at it right away with c5. And this is all extremely mainline theory so far, going right down the French a1 auto route, and for the next couple of moves, the focus is on the d4 square. With knight to f3, adding support, knight to c6, increasing the pressure, and neither side is interested in relieving this pawn tension, since the side who initiates the capture is only going to be helping their opponent develop and or improve the position of one of their pieces. For example, if d takes c5, then there's bishop takes c5, and black jumps ahead in development. So instead we have bishop to e3, bolstering the d-pawn further, Magnus plays a6, preparing b5, and Gukesh continues queen to d2. The b-pawn is thrust forth, seizing some queenside space, and rendering long castling completely unplayable for white at the moment, due to the threat of c4, b4, when black's pawn storm will be coming way too quickly. Now the interesting thing is, if white could make two moves at once, if he could castle and then play f5, then he'd be doing just fine, due to his kingside counterplay with ideas of f takes e6, knight to g5, queen to f2, fun stuff like that. So a single tempo makes a big difference in this position. Of course, if you really want to castle queenside, the best thing to do is to capture on c5 first, to eliminate one of those potential stormtroopers. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what Gukesh does with d takes c5. But it's not because he wants to castle. No, after bishop takes c5, he trades off his bad bishop, that is, the one on the same colored squares as his most central pawns, for Magnus's good bishop being on the opposite colored squares of his central pawns, with bishop takes c5, and after knight takes c5, he can now put his bishop to d3, where it can no longer be kicked away by black's c-pawn going to c4 as a result of the move d takes c5. But I can hear some of you asking, why in the name of all that is right and natural would you allow black to trade knight for bishop with knight takes d3 check? Well, this move, not played by Magnus, actually favors white. After c takes d3, white gets himself a shiny new d-pawn, ready to go to d4 and re-establish that central pawn wedge, while blockading black's d-pawn, on the same colored square as his light squared bishop. A bishop which is going to be tough to get any activity for. Black could try d4 here, but then white gets knight to e4, threatening to come into d6. That's not ideal. You could start with b4, but after knight to a4, now you've got a hole on c5 that's being targeted. So this line really offers black nothing. Magnus knew it, which is why in this position, he declined taking the bishop and played queen to b6, just developing, while preventing Gukesh from immediately castling kingside due to the threat of the deadly discovered check by the queen once the knight on c5 moves somewhere. Hence the move queen to f2, getting on that diagonal, eyeing that queen on b6. Now black could still play knight takes d3 here without losing his queen, since that would come with check, but this would still favor white, who would end up dominating this open c-file with his rooks if black took the time to play b4, a5 to try to give his bishop some kind of life on the a6 square. That plan is just way too slow for black, so better is the move Magnus played in the game, b4, driving the knight back to e2, at which point Magnus declines his last opportunity to take the bishop on d3 with check, and instead opts for a5, looking for that bishop to a6 next to trade off that bad bishop of his. That's his top priority right now. So after Gukesh castles kingside and bishop to a6 is planned, we now have the aggressive f5. And this is still known opening theory. f5 has been seen before, though traditionally white will more commonly play king to h1, getting off this sensitive diagonal, or put one of his rooks to d1. Magnus captures this pawn with e takes f5. It is a free pawn for the moment, since bishop takes f5 here would go down in flames to bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, and knight to b3, winning material due to the discovered check. So Gukesh instead plays knight to f4, attacking the pawn on d5. We have knight to e7 from Magnus, very nice, defending both pawns. We're still in opening theory here. Both players' moves have most likely been played by memory so far, including e6, now from Gukesh, a very nice move, threatening to take on f7, draw that black king out, and then follow up with knight to g5 check. This will not be a happy ending for black. Now he could take the pawn with f takes e6, but Magnus knows this would not be ideal after knight takes e6, removing the pawn cover from in front of the black king, threatening to win the knight on c5, hitting g7, eyeing a potential forking square. Now if knight takes on e6, black is of course going to lose his queen. So queen takes e6 is really going to be necessary. And after white picks up the knight with queen takes c5, black's not losing or anything, but he's behind in development. His king's still in the center. A white rook is going to be coming to e1 in short order. The engine's suggesting queen to c6 with a bit of an advantage to white. But in the game, Magnus plays the far superior f6. He's going to wait for a more opportune moment to pick up that stranded e6 pawn. Now, in previous master level games that have reached this position, white has tried things like bishop takes a6 or moving a rook to d1 with a roughly equal position. But Gukesh plays a novelty now with the move rook a to c1, which is definitely not engine preparation. Stockfish abhors this move and says it already gives black a borderline winning position. So what's the thinking here? Well, obviously, Gukesh wants this c-file to open after Magnus castles when he plays c3. Okay, he's threatening to take on b4 with a discovered attack on the knight on c5. And Magnus has a lot of moves here which favor black, including just b3, but he finds the strongest one, queen to d6, attacking the knight on f4 and threatening to win a piece on d3, since knight takes d3 will no longer lose the queen to queen takes b6. And this threat would not be present if the move c3 hadn't been played, removing defense of that d3 bishop. But Gukesh has almost certainly foreseen all of this and continues now with the only reasonable move for white, bishop takes a6. But after rook takes a6, his knight on f4 is still under attack, and it can't really move since it's guarding against a knight fork on d3. So best here for white, although probably losing, would be knight to d4, allowing knight to e4, hitting the queen, followed by b takes c3, when white will have to recapture with the pawn, since the knight is also hitting c3, after which the c-pawn will be weak and targeted next with rook to c8. So Gukesh decides it's best to begin with c takes b4. At least he's activating a rook, but this is actually worse after knight to e4, hitting the queen, who goes to e3, and after a takes b4, now the pawn on a2 is under fire. And white has no great way to defend it. Rook to a1 is just miserable, and it's no solution anyway, since black can just double up on the pawn with rook f to a8. So Gukesh tries knight to d4, going for piece activity with the idea of knight to b5, supporting a rook's infiltration to c7 with tempo on the black queen. It's as good a try as any in a losing position. Magnus now grabs a second pawn with rook takes a2. Here comes knight to b5, hitting the queen, who goes to e5. Looks very nice. It's on a central square, eyeing that b2 pawn. But in hindsight, something like queen to b8 could be considered a safer option, and you're going to see why shortly. Queen to e5 is still totally winning for black though, but after rook to c7 now from Gukesh, attacking the knight on e7, Magnus has but one move that will maintain his winning advantage. Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot it, but here it comes. Black's only winning move that Magnus failed to find is knight to g6. Just getting the knight out of danger while threatening to eliminate one of white's most important pieces, the knight on f4, which is defending white's passed e-pawn, also defending against the threat of checkmate on g2 once black plays queen takes b2. So what can white do? If you try to add defense to e6 with knight to d4, then of course the rook on c7 will fall. You can push the pawn to e7, but then black can just play rook to e8, and nothing has really been solved. White's e-pawn is being attacked thrice, defended only once. Knight takes g6 goes nowhere, since after h takes g6, white is just left with the two hanging pawns. Maybe the trickiest try here would be knight to d3, attacking the queen while defending b2, and preparing to meet queen takes e6 with knight to d4, which will win the f-pawn. But black has something much better here than queen takes e6, and that is d4, hitting the white queen while attacking the knight on b5. White cannot save both pieces, since knight takes d4 would drop the rook on c7. So white is forced to go for the queen trade here with knight takes e5, but after d takes e3, black remains 2 pawns up with a dangerous passed pawn of his own now. b2 is still under attack, as well as the knight on e5, who can capture on g6, but it won't help anything. White is completely finished. So that is how Magnus could have won, but in the game, Magnus, instead of finding the winning move knight to g6, played a losing blunder with rook to e8, which wasn't the only alternative to moving the knight to g6. He had several other ways to deal with the attack on the knight, like playing the passive knight to c8, d4, or even knight to g5 here, all of which more or less equalize the position. I'll leave those moves to you to analyze on your own if you'd like, but let's take a look at what's wrong with this move rook to e8. It looks okay on the surface. The knight is defended, b2 is still hit twice, d4 is still a strong idea. So what's the problem here? Well, in this position, Gukesh uncorks a move which at first glance looks simple, almost random, as if it does nothing, until you realize that it does everything. Take a minute, take an hour, study this position, and see if you can spot the one move to rule them all. Good luck, Godspeed, but here it is, the triple exclam brilliancy, played now by Gukesh like a true engine, queen to b6. A truly incredible resource, which creates two tricky threats at the same time, against which black cannot defend both simultaneously. The most obvious threat is knight to d3, which would attack and trap the black queen, since it also defends the b2 pawn. And e6 is defended by the queen on b6. The black queen has nowhere to run. Now the second threat is to take on e7, and if the rook recaptures, then queen to d8 check will force mate in 2. So that's what Magnus is dealing with here. But as you might expect, in a crazy position like this, black does have things he can try. So I just want to show you a couple lines that almost work, yet whose failure will highlight just how brilliant this move queen to b6 really is. Starting with knight to g6, opening the rook's eyes to the e6 pawn, so that now if knight to d3 is played, black can just capture there with the queen without losing any material. But here, white has queen to b7, threatening to take on g7, which will force mate in 3 moves. And black has no good defense. Maybe the most interesting try is knight to g5, so that after rook takes g7 check, at least h7 and f7 are guarded. King to f8 is probably the most resilient here, but after knight takes g6 and rook to h7, black can only delay mate by desperately sacrificing his pieces. The engine's giving moves like knight to h3 check or knight to f3 check, always a sign that something has gone horribly wrong. If black tries king to h8, then white can actually sack his rook on h7, like so, since after knight takes g6, black is getting mated with king to g8, followed by queen to f7 checkmate. So this line is hopeless for black and will inevitably end in mate one way or another. So what about counterattacking the white queen somehow? With something like knight to c8, the simplest win for white there would just be queen to c6, attacking that knight twice, while also hitting the rook on e8. You could instead try rook a to a8, so that after knight to d3, you can counter with rook a to b8, hitting the queen that way. But then white can just play queen takes rook, and after rook takes queen, knight takes queen on e5, f takes e5, and rook takes knight on e7. White emerges a full rook up, and will remain that way, for if black now captures the knight on b5, then there's rook to e8 checkmate. Which brings us to the move Magnus tried in the game, which is knight to g5, attacking e6, when Magnus's queen can no longer be trapped with the move knight to d3. However, this does nothing about the second threat white had in this position, which is rook takes e7, now executed by Gukesh, winning a piece, for if Magnus were to recapture with rook takes e7, then queen to d8 check would of course force mate after rook to e8, and queen takes e8 checkmate. So instead, Magnus moves his attacked rook to the a file with rook e to a8, hoping for a miracle, which is never going to come because Gukesh now has queen to c7 with that deadly attack on g7. While welcoming a queen trade, since he does have that extra piece, Magnus throws in a check now with queen to e3. He is a desperate man, which can be dangerous, but after king to h1 from Gukesh, Magnus becomes suddenly docile, and in this position resigns the game, being painfully aware of the awful truth that not only is he a piece down, but he's also on the verge of getting checkmated with the similar sequence to the one we looked at earlier, starting with rook takes g7 check. And in this line, since black has no piece guarding e7, you don't have king to f8, since queen to e7 would just be checkmate. And if the king goes to h8, then there's the same idea of sacking the rook on h7 and following up with knight to g6 and queen to f7 mate. So the best way for black to delay mate here would be king to h8, and then after rook takes g7, there's rook to f8, guarding f7. But maybe the simplest here for white is just h4, attacking black's only defender against the mate, starting with rook takes h7. And the engine is actually giving a mate in 10 at this point. So what a game, what an accomplishment by a 16-year-old Gukesh taking down the world's #1 player in such a spectacular fashion. Will he be the one to replace Magnus Carlsen as the next world's #1? Let me know what you think in the comments, and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already and you enjoyed this content, and I will see you soon.